The geopolitical friction within the Persian Gulf has escalated into a multi-domain standoff as the People's Liberation Army Navy deploys high-tonnage surface combatants to the Arabian Sea. Spearheading this flotilla are the Type 055 Renhai-class cruisers and Type 52D Luoyang III-class destroyers, vessels engineered specifically to contest maritime supremacy against U.S. carrier strike groups. This deployment coincides with joint trilateral naval exercises involving the Iranian Navy and the Russian Federation, signaling a consolidation of the Eurasian strategic axis against Western naval hegemony. While the specific composition of the Russian Surface Action Group remains opaque, open-source intelligence confirms the vector and operational status of the Chinese guided missile destroyers. The tactical center of gravity for the Chinese task force is the integration of the Type 346 B Dragon I active electronically scanned array radar systems. This dual-band radar architecture operates across S-band and X-band frequencies, theoretically granting the capacity to generate weapons-quality tracks on low observable airframes like the Lockheed Martin F-35C. The primary intelligence objective for Beijing is not kinetic engagement, but the acquisition of electronic parametric data regarding the spectral signature of U.S. naval aviation. By operating in proximity to U.S. assets, Chinese electronic intelligence officers aim to map the electromagnetic emissions of the F-35C Lightning II and the EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. Capturing the waveform modulation and jamming protocols of the EA-18G and the EA-37B compass call provides crucial data for updating the threat libraries of China's own air defense networks. This data harvesting operation directly enhances the anti-jamming algorithms of the PLA shipborne sensors, effectively eroding the technological asymmetry currently enjoyed by U.S. naval forces. Should the Pentagon authorize a kinetic strike against Iranian infrastructure, U.S. Central Command faces a degraded operational environment where airspace access is no longer guaranteed. Operational planners must account for the denial of airspace over Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf Cooperation Council states, forcing U.S. aircraft into predictable and vulnerable flight corridors. The logistical complexity is further compounded by the confirmed arrival of Russian heavy transport aircraft, specifically the An-124100 Ruslan and Il-76TD at Iranian air bases. These strategic airlifts suggest Moscow is expediting the transfer of advanced electronic warfare, suites or air defense components to bolster Tehran's anti-access, area denial, A2, AD bubble. Concurrently, Tehran has signaled its readiness to escalate by announcing live-fire naval exercises within the Strait of Hormuz, a critical maritime choke point for global energy transit. Intelligence reports indicate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intended to simulate swarm attacks against high-value targets, specifically modeling a strike on the nuclear-powered USS Abraham Lincoln. Such a simulation represents a direct challenge to the U.S. Navy's sea control capabilities, threatening to saturate the defensive perimeters of the carrier strike group with asymmetric munitions. However, intense diplomatic backchanneling facilitated by Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar has temporarily de-escalated the immediate probability of a ship-to-ship exchange in the littoral waters. Following these diplomatic interventions, Iran suspended the live-fire drills scheduled for the Strait of Hormuz, opting to retain strategic ambiguity rather than forcing a kinetic confrontation. Reciprocally, the United States Navy repositioned a guided missile destroyer, the USS Dinabola, moving it out of the Israeli port of Eilat on the Red Sea coast. This mutual de-escalation suggests that both Washington and Tehran have established a temporary communication mechanism to prevent miscalculation from spiraling into total regional war. Regional sources confirm that intermediaries are currently arranging a high-level meeting between U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian officials to formalize a deconfliction framework. The proposed venue for these critical negotiations is Ankara, leveraging Turkey's unique position as a NATO member maintaining functional diplomatic relations with the Iranian regime. This diplomatic maneuvering follows a statement by Ali Larijani, advisor to Iran's supreme leader, confirming structural preparations for direct or indirect dialogue with the United States. Despite the pause in live-fire drills, the strategic posture remains volatile, with U.S. naval forces maintaining a combat-ready footing throughout the Central Command area of responsibility. As of February 1, 2026, the U.S. naval order of battle in the Middle East includes 1 supercarrier, 6 guided missile destroyers, and 3 littoral combat ships. This force concentration provides the president with a spectrum of strike options, ranging from limited cruise missile salvos to sustained carrier-based air interdiction campaigns. Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has publicly dismissed this accumulation of firepower, asserting that the Islamic Republic's strategic depth renders it immune to intimidation. Khamenei's rhetoric emphasizes a doctrine of offensive defense, promising massive retaliation against any aggressor, while maintaining that Iran will not initiate the first strike. Amidst these external tensions, internal instability within Iran has drawn the attention of the U.S. administration, with President Trump commenting on the ongoing civil unrest. Using the Truth Social platform, President Trump characterized the Iranian protests as an unprecedented movement toward liberty, signaling potential U.S. support for regime change elements. Simultaneously, White House advisors are presenting the president with a menu of kinetic options, targeting key command and control nodes and nuclear infrastructure within Iran. However, the strategic assessment suggests the administration is hesitant to commit to a large-scale military intervention involving boots on the ground or sustained bombardment. The primary constraint on U.S. action is the vulnerability of the global economy to a sudden shock in energy prices caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. A kinetic exchange with Iran would likely trigger the mining of the strait, effectively severing the artery through which one-third of the world's seaborne oil flows. Economic models predict such a disruption could drive crude oil prices beyond $100 per barrel, reversing the U.S. economic recovery and spiking domestic inflation. President Trump's America First doctrine prioritizes domestic economic stability and low energy costs, making a war that spikes gas prices politically untenable. Furthermore, Iran possesses a mature ballistic missile arsenal capable of striking U.S. forward operating bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. The precision and volume of Iran's missile forces, combined with proxy groups in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq, create a saturation threat that missile defense systems may struggle to counter. The precedent of the June 2025 exchange, where Iran successfully targeted the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, demonstrates the tangible risk to forward-deployed U.S. assets. Experts from the Washington Institute warn that a limited strike could rapidly escalate into a general war, drawing the U.S. into a protracted conflict it seeks to avoid. The second major constraint is the potential erosion of the administration's international standing ahead of the critical midterm elections scheduled for November. Unilateral military action without a clear casus belli or UN mandate would likely alienate European allies and violate international statutes regarding national sovereignty. The administration is wary of repeating the diplomatic isolation experienced during previous unilateral actions, recognizing that global coalitions are necessary for effective sanctions enforcement. Critics argue that a preemptive strike would violate the United Nations Charter, specifically the principle of non-intervention, undermining the moral high ground the U.S. seeks to maintain. Despite his aggressive rhetoric, President Trump campaigned on a platform of ending endless wars, and initiating a new conflict contradicts his 2024 election mandate. Strategic analysts at the Atlantic Council emphasized that a unilateral attack would gift a propaganda victory to Beijing and Moscow, allowing them to frame Washington as the aggressor. The third critical deterrent is the sociological phenomenon known as the rally round the flag effect, which could inadvertently stabilize the Iranian regime. External military intervention historically solidifies internal cohesion, converting anti-government sentiment into nationalist defense against a foreign invader. Intelligence assessments reference the aftermath of the 2020 targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, which triggered massive state-sanctioned mobilization rather than regime collapse. The kinetic strike now would likely delegitimize the current organic protest movements, allowing hardliners to brand dissidents as agents of Western imperialism. The fourth structural weakness in the interventionist argument is the absence of a viable, unified opposition leadership within Iran capable of managing a post-conflict transition. Without a credible alternative government in waiting, regime change operations risk creating a power vacuum similar to post-2003 Iraq, fostering chaos rather than democracy. The fifth and perhaps most logistical constraint is the refusal of key regional partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar to authorize the use of their airspace for offensive strikes. These Gulf monarchies fear direct Iranian retaliation against their critical oil infrastructure and desalination plants, rendering them vulnerable to missile and drone swarms. Both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have explicitly communicated to Washington that their territory is not a launchpad for war, forcing U.S. planners to rely solely on carrier-based aviation. Consequently, the probability of a full-scale U.S. military invasion is calculated at less than 40%, with the administration favoring economic strangulation and covert support. Shifting focus to the Western Hemisphere, the administration is applying similar pressure tactics on Cuba, leveraging energy dependence as a coercive tool. On February 1st, from his Mar-a-Lago command center, President Trump revealed ongoing back-channel negotiations with Havana following threats of a total oil blockade. This follows a January 29th executive order invoking a national emergency and threatening secondary sanctions on any entity facilitating petroleum shipments to the island. The Cuban Foreign Ministry immediately condemned the move as an existential threat to national security, declaring a corresponding state of international emergency. Havana views the potential blockade as an act of economic warfare designed to precipitate systemic collapse by starving the power grid of fuel. Returning to the Persian Gulf, President Trump remains optimistic about forcing Tehran to the negotiating table through the projection of overwhelming naval power. He explicitly linked the deployment of the carrier strike group to the diplomatic objective, stating that the threat of force is the catalyst for a fair deal. Conversely, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned that any U.S. aggression would not be contained but would ignite a region-wide conflagration. Khamenei characterized the domestic unrest not as a civil rights movement, but as a hybrid war coup attempt orchestrated by foreign intelligence services. Tehran reports over 3,000 casualties in the recent violence, attributing the bloodshed to terrorist elements attacking military and religious infrastructure. Despite the inflammatory rhetoric, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi signaled that the diplomatic door remains ajar, provided that minimum trust can be restored. The Iranian conditions for de-escalation include the lifting of suffocating economic sanctions and the formal recognition of their right to uranium enrichment for civilian purposes. This diplomatic track is fragile, with President Trump issuing a de facto ultimatum: negotiate a comprehensive denuclearization deal or face a military response worse than previous encounters. The president referenced Operation Night Owl of June 2025, a limited strike campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities, as a precedent for future action. The mention of this past operation confirms that the threshold for kinetic engagement has already been crossed in this administration, lowering the psychological barrier for a second strike. In preparation for potential talks, a high-stakes meeting is being organized in Ankara involving U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian representatives. This diplomatic initiative, brokered by Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar, represents the last off-ramp before the current standoff escalates into irreversible conflict. Domestically, the U.S. administration is facing its own internal security challenges, with President Trump issuing strict directives regarding civil unrest. On January 31st, the president ordered the Department of Homeland Security to refrain from intervening in Democrat-led cities unless specifically requested or if federal property is threatened. This directive emphasizes a strict demarcation of federal versus state responsibility, placing the burden of local law enforcement squarely on municipal leaders. However, the order explicitly mandates aggressive defense of federal courthouses and administrative buildings by ICE and Border Patrol tactical units. We will not allow our courts or federal buildings to be damaged in any way, the president stated via Truth Social, drawing a hard line on the protection of federal sovereignty. This policy comes in the wake of significant unrest in Minneapolis, where the deployment of 3,000 federal officers sparked controversy and legal challenges. Tensions escalated after federal agents were involved in a lethal engagement, resulting in the deaths of 2 American citizens and triggering renewed protests. Local officials, including the Minnesota Attorney General, have accused the Department of Homeland Security of overreach and violating constitutional rights. Despite these legal challenges, a federal judge recently denied the request to remove federal agents, validating the administration's authority to protect federal jurisdiction. This domestic friction mirrors the international tension, the struggle for control, sovereignty, and the enforcement of the central government's will against resistance. Amidst this turmoil, a contrasting narrative of control and composure is presented through the release of the documentary Millennia, 20 Historic Days. Released on January 30th, the film offers a curated perspective on the First Lady's role during the transition period leading up to the 2025 inauguration. Produced with Melania Trump's direct involvement, the documentary serves as a strategic communication tool, shaping the public perception of the First Family's private dynamic. Senior advisor Mark B. Mann characterizes the production as a calculated disclosure, designed to reintroduce the First Lady not merely as a spouse, but as an autonomous political operator. Breaking from the traditional passive role, Melania Trump exercised absolute creative control, personally overseeing the editing workflow, color grading, and scoring in post-production. The distribution rights were secured by Amazon for a reported $40 million, indicating the high market value placed on this curated glimpse into the Trump inner circle. The narrative architecture of the film positions Mar-a-Lago not just as a residence, but as a strategic sanctuary, insulated from the chaotic machinery of Washington. Archival footage provided by her father, Victor Navs, is utilized to humanize the family dynamic, showing Baron Trump's development within the fortified enclave of the estate. A pivotal sequence juxtaposes the state funeral of Jimmy Carter with the private one-year anniversary of Melania's mother's death, intertwining national mourning with personal grief. Technical details of the inauguration are highlighted, with designer Hervé Pierre explaining the seamless construction of the ceremonial gown as a metaphor for flawless public presentation. The film documents direct diplomatic engagements, including a video conference with French First Lady Brigitte Macron regarding child welfare initiatives. Strategic networking is further evidenced by a summit with Queen Rania of Jordan, aimed at expanding a coalition of soft power influence across the Middle East. Significantly, the documentary claims credit for a tangible geopolitical outcome: the release of hostage Keith Siegel from Hamas captivity in Gaza. Following a meeting with Aviva Siegel, the First Lady reportedly leveraged back-channel influence to expedite the negotiation, resulting in freedom 12 days post-inauguration. Security protocols heavily influenced the inauguration logistics, with the ceremony relocated to the enclosed Capital One arena due to the threat environment. The decision cites the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in July 2024, necessitating a controlled environment over the traditional open-air Capitol steps. Being in a secured, enclosed space provided a necessary psychological assurance, the First Lady narrates, acknowledging the permanent alteration of their security posture. Behind-the-scenes footage captures the president rehearsing his address, where Melania interjects to amend his self-description from peacemaker to peacemaker and unifier. This editorial insertion was retained in the final speech, showcasing her subtle but direct impact on the president's rhetorical messaging. The documentary concludes with the official portrait session by Annie Leibovitz, interpreted by longtime aides as a declaration of her evolved confidence and intent. While Washington focuses on soft power, Beijing is executing a brutal internal consolidation of hard power through a renewed anti-corruption purge. On January 31st, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, CCDI, announced the investigation of Wang Xiangxi, the sitting Minister of Emergency Management. Wang, formerly the chairman of China Energy Investment Corporation, is being probed for severe disciplinary and legal violations, a euphemism for corruption and disloyalty. The investigation of an incumbent minister is statistically rare and signals an intensification of President Xi Jinping's blade inward purification campaign. This follows a record-breaking year where 65 high-ranking officials were purged, with the dragnet now expanding to university heads and state-owned enterprise executives. Simultaneously, the investigation has reached the highest echelons of the People's Liberation Army, targeting the very core of the Central Military Commission, CMC. The PLA Daily, the official mouthpiece of the military, published a front-page editorial confirming the investigation of General Zhang Yuxia and General Liu Zhenli. Zhang Yuxia serves as the vice chairman of the CMC and Liu Zhenli as the chief of the Joint Staff Department, marking the most significant military purge since 1989. The editorial utilized visceral language, calling for the complete surgical removal of toxic residue to ensure the absolute purity of the armed forces. These removals are not merely administrative but existential, directly linking the accused generals to political cliques that threaten the chairman responsibility system. Intelligence indicates this purge is the culmination of the 2023 rectification campaign that began with the rocket force and spread through the equipment development departments. The charges imply that the corruption compromised the combat readiness of China's strategic deterrent, specifically the reliability of missile stockpiles. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, interpreted the move as evidence of systemic rot within the PLA modernization program. Rubio noted that billions of dollars allocated for military expansion have likely been siphoned off, potentially affecting Beijing's timeline for kinetic operations against Taiwan. They are trying to fix a deep internal failure, Rubio assessed, highlighting that while the purge strengthens Xi's political control, it may temporarily disrupt command continuity. The removal of a CMC vice chairman sends a shockwave through the officer corps, enforcing the dictum that no rank affords immunity from the party's disciplinary apparatus. This internal volatility in Beijing contrasts with the legalistic gridlock currently paralyzing the U.S. Department of Justice regarding the Jeffrey Epstein files. On January 30th, the DOJ released over 3 million pages of documents related to the deceased financier, yet faced immediate backlash for excessive redactions. Critics, including key Democrat lawmakers, accused the DOJ of withholding nearly 50% of the relevant archive despite a congressional mandate for transparency. Assistant Attorney General Todd Blanche defended the partial release, citing the need to protect the privacy of victims and sensitive content involving minors. However, the House Oversight Committee has issued subpoenas demanding the full, unredacted cache, arguing that the current release obstructs congressional oversight. A coalition of 20 survivors issued a scathing statement, arguing that the chaotic release exposed victims to re-traumatization while continuing to shield powerful accomplices. We are being named and scrutinized, while the enablers remain in the shadows, the victim statement read, highlighting the asymmetry of the disclosure. Congressman Ro Khanna has demanded a specific briefing to review the withheld material, including FBI interview summaries and draft indictments from the 2007 Florida investigation. The handling of these files has become a bipartisan flashpoint, fueling public distrust in federal institutions and their willingness to prosecute elite criminality. This domestic erosion of trust mirrors the international skepticism facing U.S. economic statecraft, particularly the aggressive sanctions regime against Cuba. Following the U.S. threat to penalize nations selling oil to Havana, a geopolitical bloc has formed to challenge the legitimacy of Washington's economic warfare. China, Russia, Venezuela, and Mexico have all issued formal condemnations, framing the U.S. policy as a violation of international trade law and humanitarian principles. In Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun explicitly framed the U.S. sanctions as an assault on the right to subsistence, a core tenet of Chinese human rights discourse. China's declaration of support goes beyond rhetoric. It signals a potential economic lifeline, mirroring the clandestine oil transfers that have sustained sanctioned regimes elsewhere. At the United Nations, Russian Representative Vasily Nebenzia drew a sharp red line, warning that Washington cannot replicate its Venezuela playbook of regime change in Havana. The Kremlin's involvement introduces the specter of Russian naval escorts for oil tankers, a scenario that would recreate the dynamics of the 1962 blockade, but with modern anti-ship missilery. Venezuela, the primary supplier of Cuba's crude, described the U.S. executive order as a violation of the freedom of navigation, rejecting the extraterritorial application of U.S. law. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Yvonne Gil utilized Telegram to rally the resistance axis, framing the sanctions as a collective threat to all nations operating outside the petrodollar system. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum added a critical layer of diplomatic complexity, stating that Mexico is actively reviewing options to materially support the island. Sheinbaum's administration refuses to align with the blockade, citing the Estrada doctrine of non-intervention, effectively creating a diplomatic breach on the U.S. southern border. In response to the existential threat posed by the energy cutoff, the Cuban government formally declared a state of international emergency. Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parilla characterized the U.S. move as an extraordinary threat, legally paving the way for Havana to solicit emergency military and economic aid from adversaries of the U.S. This declaration effectively internationalizes the Caribbean crisis, inviting foreign powers to challenge the U.S. naval cordon under the guise of humanitarian relief. The strategic irony of President Trump's approach is his simultaneous assertion that a deal with Cuba is imminent, applying maximum pressure to force capitulation. "I think they will come to us," Trump stated, employing his signature transactionalist negotiation style: create a crisis, then offer the only path to de-escalation. This methodology mirrors his strategy with Iran: deploy a carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf while publicly predicting a denuclearization treaty. However, military analysts warn that this dual-front pressure squeezing Iran in the Strait of Hormuz and Cuba in the Florida Straits risks overextending U.S. naval assets, maintaining a credible blockade posture in the Caribbean, while projecting dominant combat power in the Middle East stretches the deployments of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers to their limit. The operational tempo required to sustain two simultaneous maritime containment zones degrades maintenance cycles and crew readiness, creating vulnerabilities elsewhere. This overextension is precisely what the Chinese-Russian-Iranian axis seeks to exploit, forcing the U.S. to dilute its presence in the Indo-Pacific theater. The presence of the PLA Navy in the Arabian Sea is not just a training exercise. It is a demonstration that Beijing can project power into the U.S. Central Command's backyard. Intelligence gathered by the Type 055 cruisers on the acoustic signatures of U.S. submarines in the region provides long-term value for Chinese anti-submarine warfare (ASW) modeling. Furthermore, the integration of Russian heavy lifters like the N-124 into the Iranian logistics chain implies a hardening of Tehran's air defense network against U.S. stealth platforms. If Moscow is supplying advanced jamming pods or S-400 components, the permissive environment U.S. war planners rely on for air supremacy is fundamentally altered. The threat landscape is further complicated by the electronic warfare capabilities of the Chinese destroyers, specifically their ability to challenge the EA-18G Growler. The EA-18G is the cornerstone of U.S. suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD. If its jamming frequencies are compromised, the survivability of strike packages drops precipitously. This technological espionage game is high stakes. The first side to effectively update their threat library gains a decisive advantage in the opening hours of any conflict. Amidst this global chessboard, the internal U.S. political scene remains a critical variable, specifically the administration's ability to maintain domestic order. The deployment of federal agents to Democrat-led cities creates a fragmented internal security picture, where local and federal law enforcement may be operating at cross purposes. The protection of federal property mandates serves as a legal foothold for the administration to project federal force into hostile municipal jurisdictions. This domestic friction absorbs political capital and attention, potentially distracting the executive branch during a fast-moving international crisis. The convergence of these timelines, unrest in U.S. cities, a naval standoff in the Gulf, and an energy blockade in the Caribbean creates a polycrisis environment. In this volatile context, the diplomatic channel opened in Ankara between Steve Witkoff and Iranian officials becomes the single most important wire in the circuit. Failure in Ankara could lead to the collapse of the temporary truce, triggering the live-fire drills in Hormuz that were previously suspended. The Iranian leadership faces its own internal pressure cooker. Compromising with the Great Satan while suppressing a coup attempt carries immense domestic risk. Hardliners within the IRGC may view a limited conflict as preferable to a diplomatic surrender, using external war to silence internal dissent. Conversely, President Trump needs a foreign policy win to validate his peace through strength narrative ahead of the midterm elections. A successful deal that creates a new nuclear framework with Iran would be a crowning achievement, but the path requires navigating a minefield of miscalculations. The introduction of the night owl precedent suggests the U.S. is willing to use limited force to bring parties to the table, a strategy of escalate to de-escalate. However, history illustrates that limited strikes in the Middle East rarely remain limited, often expanding into protracted engagements due to mission creep. The global energy market remains the ultimate hostage. A spike to $100 plus oil would undo the administration's economic achievements and fuel global inflation. This economic interdependence acts as a restraint, yet the sheer density of military hardware in the region increases the probability of an accidental engagement. A single rogue drone strike or a misinterpreted radar lock could bypass the diplomatic safeguards, forcing commanders to react before politicians can confer. As the fleets maneuver and the diplomats talk, the window for a peaceful resolution narrows, governed by the immutable logic of action and reaction. The world watches Ankara, waiting to see if the art of the deal can function in a theater defined by religious ideology and existential survival. Ultimately, the outcome will depend on whether the fear of mutual economic destruction outweighs the desire for strategic dominance. The strategic value of the Arabian Sea encounter cannot be overstated. It acts as a live-fire laboratory for the People's Liberation Army Navy to validate its anti-stealth kill chains. By shadowing the USS Abraham Lincoln, Chinese destroyers are likely attempting to fingerprint the radar cross-section fluctuations of the F-35C during different flight maneuvers. This parametric data is critical for training the artificial intelligence algorithms governing China's HQ-9B long-range surface-to-air missile systems, theoretically narrowing the kill probability gap. If Beijing successfully decodes the low probability of intercept LPI radar modes used by the F-35, the first-shot advantage of U.S. naval aviation is severely compromised. Furthermore, the integration of Russian technical advisors into Iran's Air Defense Command suggests a rapid upgrade to the passive detection capabilities of the Islamic Republic. Intelligence sources speculate that the heavy airlifts include components for the Abtubeza-M electronic intelligence system, capable of detecting stealth aircraft via their electromagnetic emissions. The convergence of Chinese naval sensors and Russian ground-based electronic warfare creates a multi-layered A2-AD bubble that mirrors the density of the Taiwan Strait. This Eurasian integration of military hardware forces U.S. planners to treat the Persian Gulf not as a permissive environment, but as a contested zone requiring maximum force protection. Amidst this hardening of global battle lines, the Trump administration is deploying a sophisticated soft power counteroffensive spearheaded by First Lady Melania Trump. The documentary Melania: 20 Historic Days is not merely entertainment. It is a psychological operation designed to project stability and humanize the executive branch during a crisis. By showcasing her direct involvement in high-stakes hostage negotiations, the film subtly reframes the administration's image from chaotic unpredictability to calculated, compassionate effectiveness. Her meeting with Queen Rania of Jordan is particularly significant, creating a parallel diplomatic track that bypasses the friction often associated with President Trump's rhetoric. This First Lady diplomacy acts as a shock absorber, maintaining open lines of communication with moderate Arab states while the Pentagon postures for war. The film's release timing, coinciding with the Gulf crisis, serves to reassure the American electorate that the White House is functioning with discipline and purpose. However, this narrative of stability is challenged by the ongoing friction between the White House and the deep state bureaucracy, epitomized by the Epstein Files saga. The Department of Justice's refusal to fully unseal the Epstein archive is viewed by the administration's base as evidence of a corrupt, entrenched elite protecting its own. Congressman Ro Khanna's push for the release of the Florida 2007 draft indictments threatens to expose systemic prosecutorial misconduct, spanning multiple administrations. If these documents reveal that intelligence agencies protected Epstein as an asset, it would shatter public trust in the very institutions currently managing the Iran crisis. This internal erosion of institutional legitimacy complicates the president's ability to rally national unity for a potential foreign conflict. A fractured domestic populace, skeptical of federal intelligence narratives, is less likely to support a preventive war based on imminent threat warnings. Simultaneously, Beijing is ruthlessly eliminating its own internal friction through the purge of Generals Zhang Yuzhe and Liu Zhenli. Unlike the messy, public legal battles in Washington, Xi Jinping's consolidation is swift, opaque, and absolute, removing any potential dissent within the military hierarchy. The removal of the chief of the Joint Staff Department suggests that Beijing is clearing the deck of peacetime generals to replace them with wartime loyalists. This reorganization likely streamlines the command and control structure, removing bureaucratic hurdles for rapid mobilization in a Taiwan or South China Sea scenario. While Washington argues over redactions and jurisdiction, Beijing is optimizing its kill chain from the Central Military Commission down to the destroyer captain. The juxtaposition is stark: a U.S. system paralyzed by legalism and internal transparency battles versus a Chinese system sharpening its blade through authoritarian purge. Back in the Caribbean, the standoff over Cuba is evolving into a test of the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century. The arrival of Russian or Chinese tankers to break the U.S. energy blockade would constitute a direct challenge to U.S. hemispheric hegemony. Pentagon strategists are wargaming scenarios where U.S. Coast Guard cutters are forced to intercept Chinese-flagged merchant vessels, a diplomatic nightmare. Such an interdiction would trigger immediate countermeasures by Beijing in the South China Sea, potentially targeting U.S. commercial shipping transit. This global interconnectivity means that a tactical decision off the coast of Havana has immediate strategic consequences in the Taiwan Strait. President Trump's strategy relies on the assumption that economic pressure will force capitulation before these military tripwires are crossed. His statement, "I think we will make a deal," reflects a belief that adversaries ultimately prioritize economic survival over ideological pride. Yet, the ideological rigidity of the Iranian regime and the nationalist fervor of the Chinese leadership may prove impervious to transactional logic. The risk calculation changes if Tehran views the U.S. mobilization not as a negotiating tactic, but as the prelude to inevitable regime change. Under use it or lose it logic, the IRGC might decide to launch their ballistic missile inventory before U.S. airstrikes can degrade the launch sites. This fear paradox is the most dangerous variable. U.S. defensive moves are interpreted as offensive preparations, triggering the very war they aim to deter. The diplomatic channel in Ankara is the only mechanism currently capable of breaking this feedback loop of escalation. Sources indicate that the U.S. envoy is carrying a proposal offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for a verifiable freeze on uranium enrichment. However, the trust deficit remains the primary obstacle. Tehran demands guarantees that a future U.S. administration will not renege on the deal. Without a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate, an impossibility in the current political climate, any agreement is merely a temporary executive truce. As the sun sets over the Persian Gulf, the radar operators on the USS Abraham Lincoln and the CNS Nanchang watch their screens, waiting for a blip that signals the start of the next war. The margin for error has vanished. The world is effectively operating on a launch on warning footing across 3 continents. In this hypertense environment, the silence of the guns is not peace, it is merely the holding of breath before the plunge. As the Ankara summit commences, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff faces a table of Iranian negotiators emboldened by their new sign of Russian security guarantees. The diplomatic atmosphere is icy, defined by the lingering shadow of the June 2025 Operation Night Owl strikes, which Tehran cites as proof of American perfidy. Witkoff's mandate is precise: secure a verifiable de-escalation protocol that precludes a maritime closure of the Strait of Hormuz without formally lifting primary sanctions. This freeze-for-quiet proposal attempts to buy time for the U.S. administration to navigate the midterm election cycle without an energy price shock. Image of map showing the Strait of Hormuz choke point and nearby Iranian missile batteries. However, the Iranian delegation, aware of the U.S. domestic political calendar, is leveraging the threat of $150 oil to extract maximum concessions on frozen assets. They understand that a gas price spike in October 2026 would be politically fatal for the Republican majority, effectively weaponizing the U.S. voter against the White House. Intelligence analysts warn that if the Ankara talks collapse, the IRGC has pre-authorized gray zone attacks on commercial shipping to demonstrate capability without triggering. Article 5. These asymmetric tactics would involve limpet mines and drone strikes on non-U.S. flagged tankers, creating plausible deniability while spiking insurance premiums globally. Meanwhile, the U.S. domestic front remains a theater of ideological combat. with the Epstein file release acting as a catalyst for institutional delegitimization. The limited hangout strategy employed by the DOJ, releasing millions of pages while redacting key names, has backfired, fueling conspiracy theories rather than quelling them. Societal cohesion is further strained by the visible presence of federal tactical teams in Minnesota, creating visuals that rival the overseas conflict zones. Image of side-by-side comparison of U.S. federal agents in Minneapolis and U.S. troops abroad. Adversarial propaganda networks, particularly those run by the Kremlin, are amplifying these images to portray the United States as a nation at war with itself. This information warfare aims to paralyze U.S. decision-making by forcing the president to focus on domestic stability rather than foreign power projection. In this context, the investigation into Chinese Minister Wang Xiangxi reveals the stark contrast in how rival superpowers manage internal threats. While Washington navigates due process and public outcry, Beijing eliminates threats to regime stability with silent, administrative efficiency. The purge of the Chinese military leadership is now understood not as a sign of weakness, but as a pre-war hardening of the command structure. By removing corrupt elements, Xi Jinping is ensuring that when the order is given, the PLA rocket force will execute without hesitation or logistical failure. Back in the Gulf, the U.S. Navy's heavily defended carrier group represents the pinnacle of 20th century power projection, yet it faces 21st century vulnerabilities. The proliferation of hypersonic anti-ship missiles means that the cost of a single defensive failure is the loss of a capital ship and 5,000 personnel. Such a loss would not only be a tactical defeat but a strategic cataclysm, signaling the end of unquestioned American naval supremacy. Consequently, the U.S. rules of engagement, ROE, are tighter than ever, placing immense psychological pressure on the commanders to identify threats correctly in seconds. The presence of the Chinese Type 055 cruiser, acting as a high-fidelity sensor node, complicates this picture by potentially feeding targeting data to Iranian coastal batteries. This data link capability essentially integrates Iran into China's global kill web, allowing Beijing to fight a proxy war against the U.S. Navy without firing a shot. On the soft power front, the Millennia documentary continues to perform well, tracking as a deliberate counter-narrative to the chaos of the geopolitical arena. Analysts note the film's specific focus on sovereignty and protection mirrors the president's political rhetoric, reinforcing the administration's coherent worldview. The segment detailing the retrofit of the inauguration venue due to assassination threats serves as a grim reminder of the physical risks facing the leadership. It implicitly argues that extreme security measures, whether in the Capital One arena or at the border, are necessary responses to a dangerous world. As the timeline advances toward the November midterms, the administration is caught in a pincer movement between foreign escalation and domestic division. The Cuban crisis remains the wild card. If Mexico or Russia successfully breaks the blockade, the credibility of U.S. sanctions collapses globally. A successful blockade run would embolden other nations to bypass the dollar-based financial system, accelerating the trend toward multipolarity. President Trump's dealmaker persona is thus being tested against the hard physics of military alliances and the cold math of global energy markets. The Ankara meeting is expected to conclude within 48 hours. The outcome will determine if the fleets stand down or if the safety catches are released. Unconfirmed reports suggest the U.S. is preparing a package of technical support for the Iranian opposition if the talks fail, shifting to a regime change strategy. This mirrors the maximum pressure campaigns of the past, but in a world where Iran now possesses the backing of two nuclear-armed superpowers. The geopolitical structure has calcified into two distinct blocks, with the gray zone for neutrality rapidly disappearing for nations like Turkey and Qatar. Every nation is being forced to choose a side in the supply chain war, dividing the world into rival technological and economic ecosystems. The U.S. reliance on the USS Abraham Lincoln as the primary instrument of diplomacy underscores the lack of other viable levers in the region. When the only tool deployed is a hammer, every problem from nuclear proliferation to civil unrest begins to look like a nail. Yet, the restraint shown by both sides suggests a mutual recognition that the next rung on the escalation ladder leads to unmanageable chaos. The Cold War dynamic has returned, but with higher velocity weapons and lower thresholds for the use of force. As night falls in Washington, the silence in the Situation Room is broken only by the hum of cooling fans and the low murmur of intelligence analysts interpreting live data feeds. Across the globe, the chessboard is set, from the frozen streets of Minneapolis to the sweltering decks of destroyers in the Gulf of Oman. The interconnected nature of these conflicts means that a misstep in one theater, a blockade runner sunk in the Caribbean, a protest turned violent in Tehran, ripples instantly across the others. We are witnessing the death of the post-Cold War consensus and the birth of a raw, friction-based multipolar order, where power is the only currency. In this new era, The distinction between peace and war has evaporated, replaced by a permanent state of conflict beneath the threshold of kinetic exchange. The Melania documentary serves as a cultural artifact of this transition, attempting to impose a narrative of grace and order upon a reality defined by chaos. Yet, even the curated lens of a documentary cannot fully obscure the armored limousines and the concentric rings of security that now define the American presidency. As the credits roll on the film and the sun rises over the Atlantic, the USS Denebola remains on station, its missile tubes cold but ready. In Beijing, the empty chairs of the purged generals serve as a silent warning to the survivor. Absolute loyalty is the prerequisite for survival in the coming storm. And in Tehran, the regime watches the horizon, calculating whether the American eagle has the will to strike or if its wings are clipped by internal division. The diplomatic cables from Ankara will soon determine if 2026 is remembered as the year of the deal or the year the fire finally spread. Until that decision is made, the world remains suspended in the amber of strategic ambiguity, waiting for the first domino to fall. This is the reality of the power narrative. Systems do not care about intentions. They only respond to pressure, leverage, and the credible threat of destruction. The fleets are moving. The sensors are active. The deal is on the table.